My name is Fonda Marshall, and I am 29 years old. On my wedding day, I found my father, a man who spent 35 years in steel-toed boots, standing in a hallway because he had no seat, while 9 of my husband's wealthy relatives sat at the table that was supposed to be his. Table 1, front and center, was where my parents belonged. Instead, someone had moved them to table 14, a folding table wedged between the kitchen door and a trash can. When I asked my husband to be why, his response cracked open every lie I had been telling myself for 2 years. I stood in that hallway in my wedding dress, with 200 guests waiting on the other side of the wall, and I made a decision that changed everything. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if this story genuinely resonates with you. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you are listening from. Now let me take you back to the morning of June 14th, the last morning I ever woke up as Garrett Whitfield's fiancée. I grew up on Birch Lane in Millfield, Ohio, a town where everyone knows your name, for my sovel. Detola Lemikyu. My father, Dave Marshall, was a plumber. He spent 35 years fixing pipes, working until his knees and back gave out just to ensure I never lacked anything. My mother, Linda, worked the cafeteria line at the local elementary school, serving 400 kids a day and knowing every single one of their names and allergies. We weren't wealthy, but our home was full of warmth and hot dinners. I worked my way through college on loans and scholarships, eventually becoming a nurse practitioner. I built my life with my own hands, but the foundation was always Dave and Linda Marshall. Then, I met Garrett Whitfield. He was tall, dark-haired, and possessed a jawline that looked designed in a boardroom. The Whitfields were a different world. Real estate developers 3 generations deep, with their name on subdivisions and country club plaques. His mother, Constance, was a woman of silk and pearls who looked at my job at a community clinic and called it interesting in a tone that felt like a locked gate. Garrett was charming, but as the wedding planning began, the version of him I loved started to blur. Constance took over everything: the venue, the menu, the guest list. When my mother suggested a simple family recipe for an appetizer, Constance dismissed it, say this was a seated dinner, not a potluck. Every time I pushed back, Garrett's answer was the same. Let mom have this babe. After the wedding, it's just us. I chose to lose the small battles to win the war of our future marriage. I didn't realize that the wedding day wasn't the war. It was the final rehearsal. The wedding was at the Whitfield Country Club, an $85,000 event filled with white peonies and gold-rimmed Chargers. My parents had contributed $12,000 toward the cater, money they had saved over 15 years from a plumber's pension and a cafeteria worker's paycheck. After the ceremony, I slipped into the reception hall to check the final setup. Table what? The head table was set for 10 WDAM data. I picked up the place cards. Whitfield. 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 My parents were nowhere to be found. I kept searching until I found them at table 14, a backup folding table tucked against the swinging kitchen door, 2 feet away from a trash can with a foot pedal. The seating chart I had approved 3 weeks ago had been discarded. The wedding coordinator told me Constance had adjusted it that morning, claiming I had approved it. I found Garrett in the groomsmen's suite, adjusting his monogrammed cufflinks. When I told him about the table, he didn't look up from the mirror. Mom rearranged some things. It's not a big deal, he said. He told me Constance had her reasons, that important people like the Hendersons and Porters needed those front seats. He called me emotional and told me to just get through the night. I walked out, my heart heavy. In the corridor, I found the printed programs. The page dedicated to love and gratitude had been reprinted. My parents' names, the people whose sacrifices made the day possible, had been erased entirely. Constance had replaced my words with a list of Whitfield family foundations. I went back to the groomsmen's suite to demand he fix it. The door was cracked open. I heard Constance's voice, sharp and controlled. Garrett, look at her father. That suit is from 2005. Done her mother. Did she sew that dress herself? They look poor. You cannot have them at the front table. Our guests will think. And then I heard Garrett's reply. I know, Mom. The Hendersons are sitting right there. The Marshalls are fine in the back. It's more appropriate. Constance hissed back. She doesn't belong here. I stood in the hallway, the air leaving my lungs. My father, who had spent 35 years on his knees under sinks to give me a life, was being called an embarrassment. My mother, who had spent 3 weekends sewing her dress to look her best for me, was being mocked. And the man I was supposed to marry had agreed with it all. I pushed the door open. Constance smiled her plastic smile, but I told them I had heard everything. I looked at Garrett and asked what part of Dad looks poor. I had misunderstood. He tried to use his client meeting voice, telling me I was being emotional. He didn't offer an apology. He didn't offer to move the tables. He just wanted to get through the night. I walked away and found my best friend and maid of honor, Margot. She reminded me of a critical fact: we hadn't signed the marriage license yet. The ceremony was symbolic. The legal bond required a signature that was currently sitting in a leather folio at the coordinator's desk. I went to table 14. My dad was sitting there, his hands flat on his knees, proud and silent. He smiled at me and said,
I can sit anywhere, baby girl.
"This is your day." My mother was smoothing her handmade dress, flinching every time the kitchen door swung open with a bang. They were sitting next to a trash can, while their $12,000 paid for the salmon the Whitfields were currently eating. Constance walked past them toward the bar, leaned toward her friend and said, "Bless her heart, someone should have bought her a proper dress. You have to know your place." My mother's eyes dropped to the table. My father just held her hand. I was done. I went to Garrett one last time and told him to make his mother apologize. He looked at the room, the Hendersons, and the Prestige, and he said, "I'm not making a scene, Fonda. Your parents will be fine, they're tough." He chose his mother, he chose the Prestige, he chose Table Lot. I walked to the stage. The MC was mid-anecdote when I took the microphone from his hand, that the room went silent. I looked at the 200 guests, at Constance's hardened smile, and at Garrett's locked jaw. "I know you came to celebrate a wedding," I said into the microphone, my voice steady from years of ER triage. "But I owe you the truth about what is happening in this room." I pointed to the back of the room. "My parents are sitting at table 14. I'd like everyone to look at table 14. 200 pairs of eyes swept to the back corner of the room, past the centerpieces and the crystal, and found Dave and Linda Marshall sitting at a folding table between a service cart and a trash bin. I watched the reactions move through the crowd like weather confusion, then recognition, then a slow tightening of faces as they understood the insult. Jim Henderson put down his fork. His wife Carol pressed her hand to her mouth. Nurse Patricia, the woman who had trained me in the ER, just closed her eyes and shook her head. 12 hours ago, I continued, my voice echoing through the silence. My parents were seated at table 1, right here in front, where the families of the bride and groom are supposed to sit. That was the seating chart I approved. This morning, that changed. Someone replaced every place card at the head table so that my parents could be moved to the last seat in the house. I looked directly at Constance, whose face was now the color of chalk. That person was Constance Whitfield. And when I asked my fiancé to fix it, he told me not to make a scene because the Hendersons and Porters were important. A sharp intake of breath fractured the room. I didn't stop. I told them about the programs, and then I told them about the money. Every plate you are eating tonight, the salmon, the bisque, was paid for by the $12,000 my parents saved over 15 years. They paid for the food, and Constance put them next to the garbage. The room fractured into gasps and whispers. Vivate, Constance's closest friend, set her glass down and moved her chair 6 inches away from the woman she had been laughing with just moments before. From the back, my Aunt Grace and several of my colleagues stood up like witnesses. Garrett finally stood, his face a mask of fury. "Fonda, that's not, you're twisting thing." "Sit down, Garrett," I said, not needing to raise my voice. "You had your chance to stand up for my family, and you chose not to." He sank back into his chair as Constance gripped her champagne flute so hard I thought it would shatter. I turned toward table 14 and last time. My father was sitting upright, watching me with an expression that wasn't sadness, but a quiet, profound understand. He was the strongest man I knew, and I had just watched him absorb the contempt of people who weren't fit to lace his boots. I came here today to start a marriage, I said, looking back at the crowd. But I cannot sign my name to a union where my family is treated as an embarrassment. I will not raise children who learn that love means hiding where you come from. I reached up and unpinned my veil. I folded it neatly, the way my mother had taught me to handle things with care even when letting them go. And I set it on the edge of the stage. To the guests from Millfield, thank you for being here. We're going home. I looked at the Whitfields one last time. I deserve better than a man who stays silent while his mother calls my father poor, and my parents deserve better than table 14. I set the microphone down and walked 60 feet through a room that was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I hugged my parents right there by the kitchen door, grabbed my coat from Margot, and we walked out. The last thing I heard was Constance's brittle voice shouting that I had lost my mind. That night we sat at the kitchen table on Birch Lane, the same table where I'd done my homework for 20 years. Margot called at 9:15 to confirm that the marriage license remained unsigned. I was legally single. I had walked away clean. I didn't need Garrett's 17 missed call or his desperate texts. I needed him to have been a man 6 hours earlier. He hadn't, and I couldn't unhear the things he'd said. 2 weeks later, the morning sickness hit. I sat on the bathroom floor of my parents' house and stared at 2 pink lines on a plastic test. I was pregnant, and the father was a man I had publicly left in front of 200 people. I chose to keep the baby, but I also chose to keep my distance, I told Garrett via email, making it clear that all communication would go through legal counsel. His response was a chaotic mix of pleas to fix this and threats to fight for custody. Even Constance called, her voice measured as she claimed the child was a Whitfield and that they had the best attorneys in the county. My father took the phone from me that day. He didn't yell. He didn't cross his arms. He just stood in the doorway of our home and told them, "My daughter has a lawyer. Talk to her, not to me." Then he hung up and went back to his coffee. The fallout from that afternoon didn't just break a marriage, it fractured the carefully constructed image the Whitfields had spent decades building. I stayed in my childhood bedroom for a while, surrounded by the blue gingham curtains my mother had sewn, and the smell of the orange soap my father used to scrub the day's work from his skin. Outside, the rumors in Millfield were traveling faster than any news report could. I learned about the ripples through Margot, who kept her ear to the ground while she handled the initial legal salvos from the Whitfield attorneys. Jim Henderson, Richard Whitfield's most significant development partner, had called the house the following Monday. He hadn't called to offer support. He had called to pull out of the Oak Ridge project, a mixed-use development worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He told Richard that if that was how the family treated the people closest to them, he didn't want to see how they treated a partner when things got difficult. While their business deals were stalling, I was navigating a new kind of survival. Being a nurse practitioner in a small-town clinic meant I was on my feet all day, battling the exhaustion of the first trimester while everyone who walked through the door had an opinion on my life. Some people looked at me with pity. Others looked at me like I was a hero. I didn't feel like either. I just felt like a woman who was finally seeing the world without the rose-colored tint Garrett had provided. The threats from Constance's best attorneys materialized in the form of a thick packet of custody papers delivered to Birch Lane. They were aggressive, seeking full custody before the child was even born, citing my unstable emotional outburst at the wedding as evidence that I was an unfit mother. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to remember that they had the money and I had a lunch lady and a plumber for support. But they didn't know Hannah Wells, the custody attorney Margot had found in Columbus. Hannah was a woman who made Constance look like an amateur when it came to controlled steal. She sat me down and told me that Ohio courts favor the primary caregiver and that a family's bank account is not a legal argument for taking a child away. The middle of my pregnancy was a blur of depositions and clinical rotations. I found a small apartment 3 blocks from my parents, a wood bedroom with beige carpet, and a bathroom fan that sounded like a helicopter, but it was mine. My father spent his weekends there, his rough hands reinforcing the closet rods and building a shelf out of reclaimed barn wood for the nursery. Every time he hammered a nail, it felt like a declaration of war against the people who had called him a poor plumber. Garrett showed up at my new apartment once, unannounced. He looked different. The sweep of his hair wasn't as perfect, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He stood on my doorstep and tried to apologize again, but even then, he couldn't help himself. He told me that his mother was just old-fashioned, and that I was denying our child a legacy by staying away. A legacy of what, Garrett? I asked through the screen door. A legacy of sitting by the trash can? A legacy of silence? He didn't have an answer, he never did. The turning point came when the Hope Foundation board met. Constance had chaired their annual gala for 6 years, raising more money than anyone before her. But the donors were uncomfortable. 200 people had watched her humiliate a working-class family, and the optics were toxic for a charity that claimed to help the underprivileged. They invited her to step back to focus on her family. The gala went on without her name on the program. In those quiet months, I realized that I didn't want revenge. I didn't need to see them lose their money or their subdivisions. I just needed to be in a room where my parents were respected. I spent my evenings sitting on my father's porch, watching the fireflies and listening to the low hum of my mother's sewing machine in the next room. I was 29, pregnant, and living in a beige apartment, but for the first time in 2 years, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. The war wasn't about the Whitfields anymore. It was about the tiny heartbeat I could feel kicking against my ribs. The final weeks of my pregnancy were defined by a quiet, mounting tension that had nothing to do with the Whitfields' legal maneuvers, and everything to do with the reality of the life I was about to bring into the world. I worked at the clinic until the very last possible moment, my white lab coat barely buttoning over my stomach, while Nurse Patricia and the rest of the staff shielded me from the occasional concerned phone call from Constance's associates. The legal battle over custody had reached a stalemate. Hannah Wells had been relentless, filing counter motions that highlighted the hostile environment the Whitfields had created. She made sure the court knew about the forged seating charts and the public humiliation of my parents, framing it as a pattern of behavior that would be detrimental to a child's emotional well-being. Doc Garrett's lawyers began to soften their tone, moving away from demanding full custody and toward a more realistic co-parenting proposal. They were starting to realize that money couldn't buy a favorable verdict in a room where the truth was so loud. During my 8th month, a letter arrived at my apartment that I didn't expect. It wasn't from a lawyer, and it didn't have the Hope Foundation's crest. It was from Richard Whitfield, Garrett's father. I read it standing at my small kitchen counter while Elise, the name I had chosen for my daughter, kicked rhythmically against my ribs. In the letter, Richard didn't offer excuses. He admitted that he had been in the room when the seating chart was changed, and that he had stayed silent while his wife and son marginalized my family. He wrote that his silence was a burden he would carry, and while he didn't expect forgiveness or immediate access to his grandchild, he wanted me to know that he respected the choice I had made on my wedding day. It was the first time a Whitfield had acknowledged my parents' worth without a but attached to it. I didn't reply, but I put the letter in my nightstand drawer next to Elisa's hospital bracelet. The physical toll of the pregnancy finally forced me to slow down in early February. I spent my days in the nursery my father had finished, sitting in the rocking chair he had refinished from a yard sale. The room felt like a fortress. Every item in it was a gift or a labor of love from people who actually showed up. My mother had finished the yellow flannel curtains, and they glowed in the afternoon light, casting a warm, protective haze over the reclaimed wood shelves. One evening, my father stopped by with a bag of groceries and a toolkit. He didn't say much, never bid, but he spent an hour fixing the drafty seal on my front door with a rolled-up towel and some weather stripping. As I watched him work, I thought about how Constance had called him just a plumber. I realized then that just a plumber meant he knew how to fix what was broken, how to ensure the foundation was solid, and how to keep the cold from getting in. On a Tuesday at 6:14 in the morning, Elise Marie Marshall arrived. She entered the world with a scream that shook the delivery room, and eyes that were wide and dark, searching for the faces she already knew. My parents were there, of course. Dad held her first after the nurses, his rough, scarred hands cradling her with a gentleness that brought tears to my eyes. He stood by the window with the morning light on his face, looking at this tiny person who bore his name, and for the first time in my life, I saw him cry in a way that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with pride. I gave her my name, Marshall. It was the final, non-negotiable line in the sand. She was not a Whitfield legacy. She was a Marshall promise. Before the first week was over, Garrett came to the hospital. He was alone this time. No lawyers, no mother in tow. He stood in the doorway of my room, looking at the bassinet where Elise lay sleeping. He looked small in the clinical light, stripped of the country club prestige that usually served at his armor. "She's beautiful, Fonda," he whispered. "She is," I said. He asked to hold her, and I let him. I watched him look at her jawline, so like his own, and for a second, I felt the phantom ache of the life we could have had. But then I remembered the hallway. I remembered table 14. I remembered the silence. "The paperwork is ready, Garrett," I said quietly. 2 weekends a month. No Constance without supervision. No exceptions. He didn't fight me. He just nodded, kissed the top of Elisa's head, and left. He was still the man who couldn't choose me, but for the sake of the girl in the bassinet, he was going to have to learn how to choose her. The first year of Elisa's life was a masterclass in the difference between sentiment and structure. I returned to work at the clinic full-time, eventually being promoted to shift lead, a position that came with a modest raise and a set of keys that I carried with more pride than any piece of jewelry Garrett had ever given me. My life was measured in 12-hour shifts, diaper changes, and the quiet, steady support of the Millfield community. The legal arrangement we had established held firm, though not without its growing pains. Garrett kept to the schedule, picking up Elise every 2 weeks for his allotted time. He was always on time, always polite, and always alone. Through the co-parenting app we used for all communication, I could see the slow evolution of a man who was finally learning to exist outside of his mother's shadow. He sent short, factual updates and occasional photos of Elise playing with the wooden blocks Richard had bought her. Constance, however, remained the ghost in the machine. True to my word, I never banned her from seeing her granddaughter, but I maintained the ironclad rule that any visit required the presence of myself or my parents. For a woman like Constance, who viewed boundaries as personal insults, this was a bridge too far. She called the arrangement a humiliation, and for the first year, she chose her pride over her granddaughter. She never showed up to Birch Lane, and she never stepped foot in my apartment. She remained in her 5-bedroom house on 2 acres, presiding over a kingdom that was becoming increasingly quiet. Own. Saturday afternoon, while my father was helping me install a new car seat, he paused and looked at the street as Garrett's car pulled away with Elise. "He's trying, Fonda," Dad said, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "It's late, but he's trying." "I know, Dad," I replied. "But trying doesn't undo the silence." "No," he agreed. "But it builds a new road." I realized then that my father had reached a level of forgiveness I wasn't sure I could ever match. He didn't harbor a grudge against the Whitfields. He simply moved them into a category of people who no longer mattered to his peace of mind. He was too busy being a grandfather, the kind of man who would spend 4 hours round trip to visit me in college, or 3 hours building a nursery shelf, to care about the opinions of a woman who looked at his suit and saw poverty. The social landscape of Millfield had changed irrevocably. The Whitfield name still carried weight, but it was no longer untarnished. My mother, Linda, still worked the cafeteria line, and every day she was met with a chorus of support from parents who had heard the story. She was no longer just a lunch lady to the town. She was the woman who had sat at table 14 with her dignity intact, while her daughter stood up for her. As for me, I spent my 30th birthday not at a country club, but in the backyard of the house on Birch Lane. We had a small grill going, the smell of charcoal and burgers filling the air. Margot was there, laughing as she chased Elise through the grass. Nurse Patricia brought one of her famous pies, and Thomas, her husband, sat with my father talking about the local plumbing codes. There were no gilded chairs, there were no gold-rimmed chargers or 12-piece string ensembles. My mother's dress was an old cotton favorite, and my father was in his work shirt with the sleeves rolled up. But as I looked around the yard, I realized that this was the appropriate seating arrangement. This was the legacy I was giving to Elise. I thought back to that hallway at the Whitfield Country Club, the moment I heard the words, "She doesn't belong here." I realized that Constance had been right, though not for the reasons she thought. I didn't belong in a world where love was conditional on the price of a suit or the prestige of a guest list. I belonged right here, on a mismatched folding chair, surrounded by the people who had never once made me feel like I wasn't enough. As Elise approached her second birthday, the final pieces of this long, painful architecture of a new life had settled into place. I was sitting in my living room, looking at the bookshelf my father had built, when a final message arrived from Garrett. It wasn't a demand or a plea. It was a photo of him and Elise at a park, and for the first time, he looked truly happy, in a way that wasn't for show. The legal war had finally ended with a permanent co-parenting agreement that prioritized Elise's stability over the Whitfield ego. Richard Whitfield had begun to visit occasionally, always meeting me at the clinic or a local park. He remained respectful, a man clearly trying to make amends for the silence he had once chosen. He even offered to set up a college fund for Elise, as a Whitfield legacy, but as a gift from a grandfather. I accepted, knowing that this was a bridge he needed to build. Constance remained at a distance, a self-imposed exile. She still lived in the house on the hill, but her influence in Millfield had withered. The plumber and the lunch lady she had tried to erase were now the moral center of my daughter's world. She had lost the war for her son's obedience and her granddaughter's future, because she couldn't understand that respect isn't found in a seating chart. I looked at my daughter, who was currently trying to feed a plastic dinosaur a piece of her toast, and I felt a profound sense of peace. I hadn't just saved myself that day at the country club. I had saved her. I had ensured that she would grow up knowing that her worth is inherent, that her family is enough, and that she never has to sit next to the trash to make someone else feel important. My father still fixes pipes, and my mother still serves lunch to 400 kids every day. They are the same people they have always been, steady, hardworking, and deeply kind. But now, when they walk through Millfield, they walk with the knowledge that their daughter chose them over an empire. That the truth doesn't expire. It doesn't matter if it takes 5 days or 5 years. It eventually shows up exactly when it's needed. I didn't get revenge on the Whitfields. I became someone who didn't need it. I built a life on my own terms, with the people who showed up. And that turned out to be the most devastating response of aught. My name is Fonda Marshall. I am a mother, a nurse, and the proud daughter of a plumber and a lunch lady. My daughter laughs like a hiccup, throws spoon on the floor, and will never ever be told she doesn't belong at the front table.